Thanks for checking out this video where I'm painting Walk the Grovekeeper from Guards of Atlantis II. Like all the minis in this game, I'll be sticking to the color scheme shown in the artwork, and I'll be painting in a way that's hopefully beginner friendly, and then I'll push it a little bit further with some optional steps after that. I'll start with model cleanup, then do some dry brushing with grays and white colors. Then I'll block in all of the colors, and move on to more dry brushing and washes to increase the highlights and shadows respectively. After that will be some extra steps, such as painting the detail on the mask and adding some additional highlights. With that plan in place, I'll get on to painting. So overall, the mold lines are hidden really well in this model. It was cast really cleverly to make them hard to see. So if you aren't comfortable with removing mold lines, or you just don't want to spend time on it, I think you could definitely leave them be and it won't be too noticeable at the end. If you do want to remove them, the most noticeable ones are the one running along the edge of the right forearm, and the one running along the back and the middle of the mask. There's also a small one running down the left foot, but it's pretty subtle. Lastly, there's one running down the right side of his waistcloth, but the segments shown in yellow are pretty hidden. You can optionally fill this gap between the two plastic parts where his shoulder joins his torso as well. Then I primed the model a dark gray color, and once that's dried, I mixed a lighter gray color, just something I think will be a decent step up from the dark gray, and I load it into a large soft makeup brush. I wipe almost all of the paint off of this brush until swiping it on a thumb or a paper towel doesn't leave any visible streaks of paint behind, and then I dry brush the entire model. You don't have to use a makeup brush if you don't have one. Whatever large dry brush you have on hand will work fine. I just recommend using a very large, cheap brush, ideally with soft bristles. For this step, the main thing I want to emphasize is that slow is fast. You'll get a much cleaner look if you build up the dry brushing slowly instead of trying to get all of the color on as fast as possible. And please don't feel pressured at this step to have the perfect dry brush process nailed down. This is just a pre-shade that will help to do some heavy lifting when we block in the colors later, but it's totally okay if it doesn't come out perfect, since we'll be smoothing it out and mostly covering it up in future steps. I'm also not trying to jam the brush too hard into the crevices of the model. There have been times when I've done that in the past and some wet paint was still hidden in the middle of the makeup brush, and then it got applied way too heavily to the surface. Now, the normal, conventional advice is that dry brushing does not look very good on large flat surfaces of cloth and capes and such, but on this model the waistcloth is so wrinkled with folds that I think it'll still turn out well, so I'm giving dry brushing it a shot and we'll see how it turns out. Now I mix more white into this light gray and do another round of dry brushing, spending less time on each surface and focusing mostly on the face, the forearms and shoulders, and the upper back. I also catch part of the waistcloth on the right hand side of the body here. If you don't want to spend a whole lot of time doing this pre-shade dry brushing, I think you could skip this one and head right on to doing a pure white dry brush. The last dry brush step is taking pure white, which I load into a smaller makeup brush, and apply it in more of a constrained way. I focus on the tops of each forearm by the hands, the general head and shoulders area, including the mask, and the very bottom edge of the waistcloth. At this step I'm trying to be pretty gentle, and I'm trying to just catch the very raised edges. And now all of the pre-shading is done. You can see that when I tilt the model up and down, that in general the top of the model looks very white, but tilting it back down, the underside of the surfaces look pretty gray. This is the result that I got to, but as always, don't worry if your result doesn't look the same. No matter what you do, you'll end up with a great and unique model and a good learning experience. So now we're on to the next step, just blocking in all of the initial colors. I start with the skin, mixing P3 Sanguine Base and Pro Acryl Beige Red, although any general desaturated red color that you have on hand will work fine, and I thin it down fairly substantially with water, probably to a ratio of around 1:1 parts water to paint, or even 2 parts water to 1 part paint. It doesn't really matter too much if you apply this a bit thickly, but I wicked a little bit of paint off of my brush to make sure I don't just flood paint onto the model whenever I press the brush to it. My main goal here is to keep the paint thin enough that the dry brushed highlights still show through, but opaque enough that the color doesn't look too faded or desaturated. You can also substitute any of the paints that I'm using in this blocking in colors step with speed paint or contrast paint, just use whatever you're comfortable with. Next, I take Pro Acryl Dark Jade and I mix in a good bit of water until the paint starts beading up whenever I drag it around. I'm just sort of showing what this looks like on the palette as an example of the thinned paint that I'm using when I block in each color. Then I use this paint to paint the mask and the fur and the cloth around it. You can see that as I'm doing this, I'm trying to be fairly neat and careful and not get the paint on too many other surfaces. And as I paint all of these colors in general, I'm very frequently flipping the model around to different angles and positions to find the best and easiest angle to paint each specific surface from. I also paint the jade balls on the gauntlets with this color too. Now I mix a cool dark green color into the jade and apply that in the same way as the previous steps to the armor panels. I'm following along with the art here, but if you want to cut down on the number of different colors that are used on the model, you could make this the same jade color as the mask and cloths. Then I use a rich red speed paint for the sash belts and cloth bindings, but I'm waiting until after I paint the fur to do the wrist straps. And at this point I settled on making the waistcloth a dark jade color as well. If it ends up looking too similar to the non-fabric mask and wrist ornaments, I can slightly tint one or the other or mess with the contrast on these objects to fix that. And I forgot to paint the left foot previously, so I went back to do that too. And now I make a very desaturated gray-blue by mixing Pro Acryl Payne's Gray with Vallejo Pale Gray Blue. You can sub this out with Runic Gray Speed Paint or Rust Gray or whatever other cool gray color you prefer. I try to be pretty careful not to overdo it here. It's really easy for the pigments to get caught between all the sculpted fur texture, so I make it very thin, essentially like a strong wash. I also opted for a bluish fur color because I think it's fun and might look cool against the reds and the jade colors, but if you want it to look more like a real-life fur with less contrast, you can switch out the bluish hue for a more brownish one. With the fur done, now I paint the wrist straps with the same red speed paint color as before. And now we're almost done with this stage, but first I take snakebite leather contrast paint and apply it heavily to all of the rope pieces around the mini. And as a temporary sort of stopgap solution, I thin down a green paint and apply it all over the base. I eventually want to end up with a sort of mossy cobble look, or at least attempt to do something like that, but this will be a good substitute for it. So there are a few bits and pieces that haven't gotten attention, like the teeth and the fun mask pattern, but this is a pretty good place to stop if you just want to have the mini done and ready for the table. That being said, the next steps are just more dry brushing and washes, so I encourage you to follow along. Right now it also looks a little bit like Rainbow Vomit with all sorts of red and blue and green, but that's okay. The midtone is where most of the color will live, and will make it much more cohesive and unified with the dry brushed highlights and then with the shading. Next I move on to some general dry brushing to build up highlights. I mix jade and pale gray blue and dry brush that all over the jades and the greens. I'm trying to be somewhat neat with this, but I don't fuss too much about a bit of spillover because I'll correct that later. Then I do a second pass of dry brushing, mixing in some ivory this time. And then I do another final dry brush with pure ivory. I also use this pure ivory to dry brush the fur while I'm at it. The really nice thing about dry brushing with light, fairly neutral colors like ivory or off-white pastels is that if you get some on a different surface, say on the red straps next to his fur, it doesn't look very out of place, and it's pretty easy to conceal later on with a thin highlight over that surface. I'm also trying to make this dry brushing somewhat uneven. I spend more time building up the ivory color on the fur around the shoulders and the head, and the parts of the limbs that are sticking out more, versus the parts of the fur that are lower down or more hidden, like the armpits and the lower back. This is all about making the dry brush areas look more dynamic and interesting, with more contrast between light and dark areas. Following that, I dry brush the skin with beige red, being fairly aggressive with this as well. Now at this point the highlights look pretty decent, but the shadows aren't very well defined and the mini doesn't have too much contrast yet. The next steps will be doing some shading on various parts of the model, but you can see that with some subtle dry brushing we really gave the model a boost compared to before. This is a pretty natural next stopping point, but you can really stop at any point once you have a look that you're happy with. I want to continue working on the fur, so I selectively shade down the fur in a couple of passes with a mix of Payne's Gray and Pale Gray Blue, but also incorporating a little bit of the dark jade color into it. When I do this, I'm thinning this down with a lot of water, maybe in the ballpark of 5 or 6 parts water to 1 part paint. I want it to not be too noticeable when I put it on the model. As I work around the model a few times doing this, I only put the shade in areas I think should be darker, like under the arms and around the armpits, the lower part of the back, and the sides of the head and neck. I'm thinning down regular paint into a wash instead of using a pre-made wash off the shelf, because almost all bottles of shades and washes are really dark and would make the areas between the sculpted fur tufts look way darker than what I want to achieve. The last pass of this wash I keep a little thicker and darker and apply to less of the surface area, just in the very recesses. These wash steps also have the added benefit of knocking back some of the dry brushed highlights that we did earlier, which can help if we were a little too overzealous with applying them. Then I shade the skin with some sanguine base, or whatever your darkest skin color is, trying to keep it away from the very brightest parts of the skin. It's totally okay if you end up toning the highlights down too much. You can always build them back up again later by mixing in some of your highlight color and highlighting it back up. And at this point, the red wrist straps and sashes look a little too desaturated and a bit too much like the skin. To fix that, take any fairly vibrant red paint and thin it down a bit. Then I tap my brush to a paper towel to remove most of the paint from the brush, and then I pull it over the red sashes and straps. I try to keep this from pooling in the recesses, and I try to mostly only go over the areas of the cloth that look lighter and more whitish, staying away from the dark red shadowed areas. This might look really intense, but this red paint will dull a little bit in vibrancy once it dries. Once that's dry, I mix some black wash into this red color, thin it down with water more, and apply it as a wash to the reds, being careful not to let it pool too much or spill onto the other surfaces. This should help to get a really nice defining line between these straps and the rest of the model. Now, I'm not a huge fan of how expensive Games Workshop paints are, but their shades are pretty good and I have a few on hand already. So I thin down a Thonian camo shade with a bit of water and apply that over the green armor plates. If you don't have this particular shade, you can either thin down a dark green contrast paint or speed paint, or mix a little bit of black into a dark green paint and thin it down pretty substantially with water. I also slapped this onto the base as well while I was at it, and I decided to use this shade on the tan ropes as well. I think this worked out really nicely, and it ties in the colors a little bit better rather than just using a regular brown wash on the ropes. Then I shade all of the jade cloth parts with some watered down dark jade, mixed with some black wash and some water. For the waistcloth, I mixed just a little bit of black paint in too, to really tone it down a bit more. Now I'll turn my attention to the details, highlighting up the skin and face, working on the mask and the wrist ornaments, and any other areas that I think need some extra attention. I highlight the skin in a couple of passes, keeping the paint somewhat thin and mixing a combination of sanguine base and beige red as I see fit. I go back and forth a little bit with applying highlights and shading it back down until I'm happy with the look. Hopefully you don't mind that I'm not going to talk extensively about this step or any of the following ones. It's pretty straightforward, and if you're following this far through the video, I'm assuming you have a decent grasp on how to tackle things like this. I finally focus on the mask now, looking at the art to determine which areas should be painted red or bone colored. I mix Payne's Gray with my strong red color to darken it a bit, and then apply a single highlight of red to this. Then I paint the bone areas by mixing in a little bit of brown to P3 Jack bone, and I follow this up with a wash of Agrax Earthshade, and highlight it up to ivory in a couple of passes. I'm not entirely sure if I got all the mask parts that should be bone to look like bone, but it looks good enough to me. I should mention that I also use this same bone painting process to paint the teeth, as well as all of the little dots on the sashes. To highlight the green armor, I just use this mix of ivory and white to pick out the top rims of some of the circles that are towards the top of each armor panel. I don't pick out every single one, I just choose a handful on each armor plate somewhat randomly. I use the same paint to highlight the jade mask, and I want this mask to look really shiny and pronounced compared to the darker jade that I made the fabrics look like, so I pushed the highlights pretty far on this. I also glaze a little bit of the bright jade color into the mask to make it look fairly vibrant and really stand out. After this, I paint one final highlight on the mask and wrist ornaments, pushing them almost to pure white to really make them stand out. I highlight the sashes by mixing in a bit of orange and ivory to the red from before, but trying not to go too overboard with the jump in color. Remember that this will probably dull down a little bit as it dries though. And then I selectively highlight some of the fur, using the pale gray blue from before and mixing in a little bit of white to it when needed. I'm only picking out some of the fur tuft textures very selectively, focusing mainly around the face, head, and shoulders. I also highlight the little tufts between the wrist straps, which makes it look more obvious that it's fur between those. If you don't think you have quite enough contrast in the fur yet, you can go back like I did and add a second round of even brighter and more selectively placed highlights. Almost done now, but first I paint the dots on his head and his eyes with a pure white color. Then I thin some jade and glaze that onto these surfaces, being careful not to let it pool too much, and then I highlighted it back up with a pure white. While I was at it, I also used this pure white for an extra tiny little highlight on the jade wrist balls. I'm pretty much ready to call the model done at this point, so I just do a quick heavy dry brush of a light gray color on the tiny bits of the base, and then the only thing left is taking whatever black color you prefer and painting the base rim black. Obviously it can be whatever color you want, and it won't even be very visible since it gets mostly covered by the orange or blue rubber base attachments anyway. As always, I hope this video helped you in some way or another, whether you're following along painting your own copy of Guards of Atlantis or are just looking for inspiration for something else. Let me know if there's a specific hero you want to see next, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.